The wind carried a biting chill across the high plains as a young woman clutching 10 beaver pelts stepped down from a dusty stagecoach, her eyes fixed on the distant ranch house that seemed to sag against the endless sky. She had traveled 3 days with nothing but the furs and a desperate promise whispered to her by a dying mother who believed one night of shelter could alter a life's entire course. The rancher, a quiet widower named Elias, stood frozen on his porch with calloused hands resting on his belt, unable to comprehend why a stranger would offer such wealth for a simple night under his roof. He studied her trembling fingers wrapped around the pelts and noticed the worn hem of her dress, realizing her offer was not a trick but a last act of profound dignity and hope. His own mother, the formidable widow Hattie, watched from the kitchen window with sharp, knowing eyes that had witnessed decades of heartache and survival on this lonesome land she called home. Hattie saw in the girl a reflection of her younger self, a survivor who would trade everything for a chance, and she silently vowed that one night would never be enough to heal such a wound. Elias led the stranger inside, offered her a chair by the crackling hearth, and awkwardly placed a stack of furs on the table as if they were a sacred covenant he dared not break. The girl's name was Lorna, and she spoke in halting sentences about a trapper father lost to the river and a homestead devoured by debt, leaving her with nothing but the pelts and her own resolve. Hattie served thick venison stew and dark bread while listening to every word, her heart weaving a plan as tender and tough as the leather strips she used to mend saddles. Elias, who had buried his young wife 2 springs ago, felt an unfamiliar stirring in his chest when Lorna's laughter accidentally escaped during a shared memory of catching fireflies as a child. That night, Hattie insisted Lorna sleep in her own room while Elias took the cot in the lean-to, an arrangement that made the young woman protest until the widow's gentle command silenced all objections. Under the quilt stitched with wedding ring patterns, Lorna wept silently, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming relief of being treated as a treasured guest rather than a burden to be endured. By dawn, Hattie had already risen to grind coffee and set out fresh cream, her mind carefully stitching together a future that no one else in that house had dared to imagine in their loneliest moments. She asked Lorna to stay 1 more week to help with the mending and preserving, promising that her son would view it as a kindness rather than an imposition on his solitary world. Elias, surprised by his own eagerness when his mother suggested the arrangement, found himself trimming his beard and polishing his old boots for the first time since burying his wife in the cottonwood grove. Each evening, Lorna and Elias walked the fence line checking for breaks, and in the soft golden light they traded stories about favorite horses, childhood mischief, and dreams they had nearly abandoned. Hattie observed from the garden how her son's stooped shoulders gradually straightened, as if the weight of grief was being replaced by the gentle gravity of a new and blossoming affection. One rainy afternoon, Lorna took the pelts and showed Hattie how her father had taught her to cure them perfectly, and the widow recognized skill born of love and survival that deserved far more than shelter. That very night, Hattie sat Elias down at the oak table worn smooth by generations and told him plainly that the good Lord had sent that girl not for one night but for a lifetime together. Elias flushed deep crimson and stammered that Lorna was too young and too fine for a broken man like him. But Hattie just shook her head and called him a fool who was too blind to see a blessing walking right through his door. Hattie took the 10 furs and commissioned a traveling seamstress to fashion a wedding cloak from them, declaring that every bride deserved something beautiful, even if the whole world had told her she was worthless. Lorna discovered the cloak hanging in the parlor one morning and burst into confused tears, believing she had overstayed and was being gently pushed away with a magnificent parting gift she could never repay. Hattie wrapped her in a fierce embrace and whispered that the cloak was not a farewell, but an invitation to become a daughter of that house, if her heart was willing to take such a risk. Elias walked in at that exact moment carrying a wildflower bouquet he had nervously gathered, and the sight of the two women weeping together nearly made him drop every stem into the dust. Without any practiced words, he knelt beside Lorna and told her that he had no right to ask after only a fortnight, but his soul recognized her as the missing piece of his fractured world. Lorna looked from the earnest rancher to the beaming widow and understood that the trade of 10 furs had been transformed into something sacred that no trapping season could ever provide. She said yes with a voice as clear as mountain water, and Hattie immediately began planning a wedding that would involve the whole valley and prove that joy could still grow in hard soil. The ceremony took place under the ancient cottonwood tree, where Elias had first said goodbye to his late wife, a deliberate choice that honored the past while welcoming the future with open arms. Hattie had invited every ranch hand, distant cousin, and drifting cowboy within a day's ride, creating a celebration that mixed fiddle music, roasting beef, and the scent of wild sage in the evening air. Lorna wore the fur cloak with trembling pride, and as Elias lifted her veil, he saw not a bargain bride, but the answer to every prayer he had been too stubborn to utter aloud for years. After the dancing ended and the guests dispersed into the star-filled night, the widow sat alone on the porch rocker, listening to the quiet laughter drifting from the cabin she had filled with love. In the months that followed, Lorna transformed the house with small touches such as embroidered curtains and a thriving vegetable garden that fed both body and the long-starved spirit of the home. Elias discovered that partnership did not mean losing his solitude, but sharing it with someone who understood the language of windswept grass and the call of a distant meadowlark. Hattie taught Lorna the secret recipes for sourdough starter and the medicinal uses of prairie plants, forging a bond that felt more like mother and daughter an outsider ever could. One morning, Lorna placed Elias's hand on her belly and watched his rugged face crumble into astonished tears as he realized that their love had already created a brand new life on this land. Hattie heard the news and danced a jig right there in the kitchen, proclaiming that the 10 furs had multiplied into the greatest treasure any ranch could ever hope to hold within its walls. The pregnancy was hard, with winter storms isolating them for weeks, but Hattie used every ounce of midwifery knowledge she possessed to keep Lorna strong and her son's panic at bay each anxious night. When the first cries of a healthy baby boy filled the cabin just as the spring thaw began, Elias knelt beside the bed and promised his newborn son that he would always know the story of those pelts. The widow held the infant against her chest and wept with a joy so profound it felt like every sorrow she had ever endured was finally being washed away by a flood of pure grace. They named the child Samuel Trapper McCall, binding together the legacy of the lost father and the rancher who had taken a chance on a desperate girl with 10 precious furs in her hands. As Samuel grew, he would toddle after his grandmother Hattie through the kitchen garden, learning the names of herbs and the proper way to greet a new foal in the stable without causing alarm. Lorna often sat on the porch, watching her husband teach their son to rope a fence post, and she marveled at how a single night of desperation had bloomed into a lifetime of steadfast affection. Hattie one afternoon revealed to Lorna that she had secretly written to the territorial judge before the wedding, ensuring that any lingering doubts about the marriage's legality were settled with unshakable certainty. The widow had also hidden a small pouch of gold coins inside the chimney stones decades ago, and she now gave it to the young couple to secure the ranch's future against drought or misfortune. Elias, upon learning of his mother's hidden fortune, laughed until tears streamed down his face, realizing that Hattie had been quietly running the entire world from behind her rocking chair all along. Tragedy tested them again when a cattle fever swept through the valley, threatening to wipe out years of hard work and leave the family destitute before the first snow dusted the peaks. Hattie calmly directed everyone to slaughter the sick beasts, render what they could, and replant the grazing fields with a hardy grass seed she had bartered from a passing Mormon wagon train. The crisis forged an even deeper unity among the three adults, who worked from before dawn until the stars emerged. Their hands blistered, but their hearts fiercely determined to outlast any calamity. Lorna contributed by selling her expertly tanned hides at the distant trading post, earning a reputation as the finest tanner in the county and bringing in much-needed coin that saved their winter. Elias, once a man who measured his worth in cattle, discovered that his true wealth lay in the resilient women who fought beside him and the son who called his name with adoring eyes at dusk. Samuel asked his grandmother one evening why the beautiful fur cloak hung in a place of honor above the fireplace instead of being worn, and Hattie's eyes sparkled as she prepared to tell him the origin story of his entire family. She narrated the tale of a brave girl who walked off a stagecoach with nothing but pelts and hope, and how a lonely rancher and a scheming widow turned one night into a lasting dynasty of love. The boy listened with wide eyes, clutching a small rabbit fur his mother had given him, and he solemnly declared that he would become the best rancher who ever lived to make that sacrifice worth every tear. Hattie, now well into her 70s, felt her own body beginning to slow down, but she refused to rest until she had taught Lorna every skill required to run the entire operation without missing a step. One frosty morning, the widow did not rise from her bed, and Elias found her with a peaceful smile on her face, her hand resting on the family Bible, open to the passage about a virtuous woman's worth being far above rubies. The grief that washed over the ranch was profound, yet it was threaded through with gratitude so immense that no one could weep without eventually smiling at the memory of her fierce, unrelenting love. Lorna took the fur cloak from the mantel and draped it over Hattie's coffin, declaring that the widow deserved to carry into eternity the very symbol of the legacy she had woven from 10 simple pelts. After the funeral, a stranger arrived at the gate claiming to be Lorna's long-lost uncle, a man with greedy eyes who had heard rumors of a successful ranch and a marriage built on a questionable bargain. He produced a yellow document that supposedly proved the pelts were stolen from his trapline, and he demanded compensation in land or cash, threatening to drag the family's reputation before the circuit judge. Elias, who had never backed down from a physical challenge, surprised everyone by inviting the uncle inside for a meal and calmly asking for time to examine the paper in the clear light of morning. That night, Lorna trembled with old fear until Elias held her hands and reminded her that Hattie had taught them both that the truth, when planted in good soil, always grew stronger than any lie. At dawn, Elias rode to the trading post where the pelts had originally been registered and discovered that the uncle's document was a clumsy forgery, missing the official territorial seal and containing mismatched dates. The storekeeper, an old friend of Hattie's, signed an affidavit swearing that the furs had been legally trapped by Lorna's father years before, completely dismantling the uncle's fraudulent claim before sundown. Elias confronted the man on the porch with the evidence and the quiet authority of a man who had learned from his mother that words, when true, could strike harder than any bullet ever could. The uncle fled with nothing but the sound of his own horse's hooves echoing off the butte, and the family stood arm in arm, realizing that Hattie's lessons of preparedness had shielded them yet again from ruin. Samuel, now a lanky teenager, witnessed the entire confrontation and understood for the first time that strength was not about muscle, but about the courage to defend what you loved without resorting to cruelty. Lorna decided to open a small tannery school for the daughters of neighboring homesteads, ensuring that the skill that had saved her would empower other women who might one day face their own desperate crossroads. Elias supported the project by building a workshop addition to the barn, hammering every nail with a sense of purpose that reminded him of the nights he had once spent praying for a companion to share his burdens. Young women from 100 miles around came to learn the art of curing hides, and the ranch became a buzzing hub of laughter, trade, and stories exchanged over bubbling dye pots and scraping frames. Samuel, now assisting his mother as a teacher, found himself shyly drawn to a quiet student named Miriam, whose father had been killed in a range war, leaving her with nothing but her hands and her pride. Lorna recognized the same flicker in her son's eyes that Elias had once worn, and she whispered to her husband that perhaps the cycle of rescue and love was about to repeat itself under their own roof. Elias chuckled and remarked that their home had apparently become a refuge for strays of all kinds, a legacy that the widow Hattie would have applauded with a clap of her strong, capable hands from on high. Samuel courted Miriam with the same tender awkwardness his father had shown, bringing her wild raspberries and spending hours listening to her describe the ranch she dreamed of building one day with her own two hands. When Samuel finally proposed using a ring that had belonged to Hattie, Miriam wept and said yes, and the entire tannery workshop erupted in cheers that echoed across the valley like rolling summer thunder. Elias and Lorna stood back and watched their son step into manhood, and they both silently thanked the widow whose secret planning had started a chain of love that now stretched into a new generation without end. The wedding was held beneath the same cottonwood tree, now massive and scarred with age, and the fur cloak was placed around Miriam's shoulders in a ritual that connected every bride to the brave girl who had arrived with nothing. Lorna gave a speech honoring Hattie, recalling how the widow had seen a daughter in a desperate stranger and had spent every remaining day of her life proving that family is stitched together by choice, not blood. The guests, many of whom were former students of the tannery, raised tin cups of cider and cheered for the memory of the woman who had quietly manipulated hearts into the positions where they could truly flourish. Not long after the celebration, Miriam announced her own pregnancy, and the house that had once sheltered a lonely widower now prepared to welcome the third generation born from that single night's trade. Lorna began keeping a written journal of the entire saga, starting with the day she stepped from the stagecoach and ending with the profound truth that a widow's generosity had rewritten every fate she touched. Elias, now graying and content, often sat in Hattie's old rocker on the porch, telling his grandchildren about the 10 furs that still hung, preserved inside a glass case in the main hall as a sacred family relic. The tale spread through the territory like wildfire in August, and traveling storytellers began to include the legend of the fur bride in their repertoires, though they always emphasized the widow's hidden role as the true hero. One day, a newspaperman from Kansas City arrived hoping to interview the family, and Lorna spent an entire afternoon recounting every detail while Miriam served Hattie's famous sourdough bread and fresh churned butter. The article, published under the headline, "How a Widow's Secret Gift Built an Empire of Love," brought letters from lonely hearts across the frontier who were inspired to open their own doors to strangers in need. Elias, reading the piece aloud on the porch, paused at the part describing him as a man redeemed by feminine wisdom, and he simply nodded because it was the most accurate description of his life anyone had ever written. Samuel and Miriam's first child was a girl they named Hattie, and when the infant was placed in Lorna's arms, the grandmother felt the full circle of grace close with a soft, almost audible click deep within her soul. Little Hattie grew up surrounded by the scent of tanned leather and the sound of her grandfather's harmonica, and she demanded to hear the story of the 10 furs every single night before she would agree to sleep. By her 6th birthday, the child could recite the entire narrative from memory, and she often corrected the hired hands who embellished the tale with extra bears or invented gunfights that never truly occurred. Miriam taught her daughter to read using the old journal, and the girl traced her great-grandmother's name with a tiny finger, promising to become just as wise and fearless when she grew into a woman. The tannery school eventually evolved into a full-fledged cooperative where women pooled their pelts and profits, creating a financial safety net that Hattie had instinctively understood was the only real security on the frontier. Elias lived long enough to see his granddaughter turn 12, and on his final day, he asked to be carried out to the cottonwood tree where he had first kissed Lorna so many decades before under a harvest moon. He passed with his wife's hand in his, and the sound of the family's hymns floating over the prairie, his last words being a quiet thanks to his mother for outsmarting him when he was too stubborn to see salvation. Lorna buried him beside Hattie on the hill that overlooked the entire ranch, and she planted 10 cottonwood saplings in a circle around the graves as a living monument to the pelts that had started it all. The widow's secret gift, it turned out, was never the money hidden in the chimney or the cloak made from furs, but the relentless belief that everyone deserved a home and a love that grew stronger with each passing season. Lorna, now the matriarch, sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the shadows lengthen, feeling the presence of Hattie in every creak of the rocker and every whisper of wind through the sagebrush. She often spoke aloud to her departed mother-in-law, updating her on the tannery's expansion, the grandchildren's antics, and the countless strangers who still arrived at the gate seeking work and finding a family instead. Samuel built a small chapel near the cottonwood grove where traveling preachers could stop, and its cornerstone contained a copper box holding a single piece of beaver fur as a relic of the founding miracle. The entire valley came to be known as Widow's Rest, a name that stuck after a surveyor heard the story and wrote it into the official territorial maps with a flourish of his ink-stained pen. Miriam, ever practical, wrote a pamphlet called The Combined Tanning Instructions with the story of Hattie's faith, selling hundreds of copies to pioneer women who needed both skills and inspiration. Young Hattie, now a spirited teenager, announced that she intended to study law in the Eastern City so she could return and defend the land claims of families who might face greedy uncles with forged papers. Lorna felt a surge of pride so fierce it stole her breath, recognizing that the widow's legacy had now expanded beyond the ranch to encompass a vision of justice that could reshape the entire frontier. Before the girl left on the stagecoach, the family gathered to drape the original fur cloak around her shoulders, a blessing that carried all the prayers of ancestors who had turned scarcity into abundant life. The sight of the coach disappearing over the ridge mirrored the day Lorna had arrived, but instead of desperation, the air was charged with the electric certainty that love once planted could never be uprooted. Miriam wrote letters every week, and in each one she included a pressed sage leaf, so her daughter could smell the home prairie no matter how far the train carried her into the unknown brick and stone canyons. Samuel managed the ranch with the steady hands of a man who had been shaped by his grandmother's shrewdness, his father's gentleness, and his mother's fierce determination to create something lasting and good. The tannery school eventually became a formal trade academy with a charter signed by the territorial governor, its motto etched above the door in Hattie's own handwriting: "Shelter the stranger, weave the dream." Lorna, at the age of 70, finally allowed herself to sit in the rocker during a thunderstorm and simply listen, realizing that the sound of rain on the roof was the same applause Hattie had once heard during her secret acts of orchestration. The original 10 pelts, now carefully preserved under glass in the main hall, had become a pilgrimage site for young couples who left notes of gratitude for the widow whose bold plan had sanctified their own unions. Young Hattie returned from law school with a diploma and a fiancé who was a humble cartographer, and she announced that they would settle at the ranch and open a legal aid clinic right beside the tannery cooperative. The great-granddaughter hung her diploma next to the fur display and declared that the widow's secret gift was now a living, breathing institution that would protect the vulnerable for generations yet unborn. Lorna, feeling the weight of her years, gathered the family in the chapel and told them that her time was near, but she wanted every one of them to remember that they were all woven from the same bold thread of kindness. She passed away during a luminous sunset that painted the cottonwood grove in shades of rose and gold, and the entire valley mourned the woman who had arrived with nothing but furs and become the heart of a nation. They buried her beside Elias and Hattie, and Samuel planted the 11th cottonwood sapling directly over her grave, so the roots would cradle her into eternity as she had cradled her family in life. Miriam took up the journal and added a final entry describing how the story never truly ends, because every child born on Widow's Rest carries the original spark of a desperate trade made sacred by a widow's love. The ranch continued to thrive, its reputation for justice and hospitality spreading so far that even foreign dignitaries touring the West asked to see the famous fireplace where the Pelts first rested on a cold night. A new generation of storytellers began crafting ballads about the fur bride and the widow who outwitted loneliness, ensuring that the tale would echo through honky-tonks and campfires for 100 more years. In a dusty archive in the state capitol, the original marriage certificate was discovered bearing Hattie's signature as witness, and a historian wept openly at the tangible proof of a legend that was actually all true. The great-great-grandchildren learned to read from Lorna's journal, and they argued playfully over who would inherit the honor of guarding the fur display and recounting the story at next year's Founders' Day celebration. No one who heard the tale ever looked at a simple beaver pelt the same way again, understanding that the truest wealth is never in the object itself, but in the selfless hands that dare to transform it into love. The widow gave far more than a night's shelter, because she gave a future, an unbreakable bond, and the unshakable truth that sometimes a stranger is just family you haven't yet had the courage to welcome home with all your heart.